Our reading today is called Desert Spring by Victoria Safford. They had no idea where they were going when they left that night, in the dark, without lights, without shoes, without bread, their children smothered against them so they would make no noise. They had no idea what they were getting into following this Moses, this wild-eyed one who claimed visions and made promises, but who, after all, could guarantee them nothing except death if they were caught. They had no idea, these slaves, what it could mean, this promise of land, their own country, and life abundant. Of freedom, they knew nothing except what they could taste by living in its opposite, slavery. And the taste became a hunger, and the hunger became insatiable till they were ravenous for freedom, and they went out then. But no one knows to this day whether they were led by Moses or by the outstretched arm and mighty hand of something else, of something eternal, as they would afterwards and always claim, or whether their own human hungry will made them flee that night from Pharaoh. They went into the wilderness. There they wandered 40 years, which in those days was a lifetime. 40 was a good old age, so many of them died before getting anywhere, and many were born in the desert and grew to adulthood knowing nothing but the journey, not slavery, not freedom, just the going. They whined and complained and muttered, and some mutinied, for they were a stiff-necked and rebellious people. You can read it for yourself. Ungrateful people, even when manna rained down from heaven and quails were sent to feed them. Unhappy people, longing out loud even for the familiar security of Egypt, of all places, or at least they knew what to expect, as awful as it was. Impatient people, making cheap little idols and gods of metal to bargain with in secret when the traveling got hard or merely dull, and the days and years became monotonous. In the springtime, we remember the promised land is not a destination. It is a way of going. The land beyond the Jordan, that country of freedom and dignity and laughter, you carry it inside you all the while. It is planted in your mind and heart already before you even start out. Before it occurs to you that in order to leave that life in Egypt, the intolerable bondage of that life, what you need to do is stand up and walk forward. Some of you may notice that our chalice went out. Some of you may now notice that our chalice is smaller. We need to replace the wick. And I'm mentioning this because it seems like a good metaphor right now. We may not be able to do things the same way we have always done them, but we can still light a flame. We may not be able to meet together in person, but we can still be together. We may not be a community that can all be in the same photograph, but we are still a community. Your chalices are lit. Our chalice is lit here, even if it looks a little smaller. It is still going. Today is Palm Sunday, the day that the Bible tells us that Jesus returned to Jerusalem on a donkey to celebrate the Jewish festival of Passover. Next week we'll talk about Easter, but this week I want to talk about Passover, which begins on Wednesday. Passover is the biggest and most joyful religious festival in the Jewish calendar. It tends to involve a thorough house cleaning, especially in the kitchen, getting rid of all of the grain in the house that has or could conceivably rise, locking away and symbolically selling all of the goldfish crackers and the bread and the yeast and the Oreos and the baking soda. For 10 days, observant Jews eat no bread other than matzah or matzah meal, commemorating the time that God, via Moses, led them out of slavery in Egypt. I am not Jewish, but I have celebrated Jewish holidays, particularly Passover, with our dear family friends Tom and Rivka Gewurz for nearly 20 years now. We will celebrate Passover together on Zoom on Wednesday night this year. Passover is generally celebrated with a Seder, a ritual meal that involves retelling the story of how the Jews escaped slavery in Egypt. According to the story, the Hebrew people were enslaved in Egypt for decades. And at one point, Pharaoh demanded that all the baby boys born to Hebrew women be killed. But Yaakov gave birth to a son and hid him for 3 months, and then put him in a basket among the reeds and sent his sister Miriam to watch. Pharaoh's daughter came down to the river to bathe and saw the basket. She asked her handmaiden to fetch the basket and discovered a baby inside. Conveniently, Miriam was there, and she offered to find a woman to nurse the baby. And so Moses was returned to his own mother to raise for a while, until she brought him to the Pharaoh's daughter when he was a boy. Moses was raised in the Pharaoh's court, but he did not like how the Egyptians treated the Hebrew slaves. God eventually spoke to Moses and told him he was to ask Pharaoh to let the people go. It is a hard story in many ways, difficult for us to understand. God brings 10 plagues to the land, boils, hail, frogs, the death of all the livestock. And every time Pharaoh agrees to let the people go, and every time God hardens his heart and he rescinds the offer, and then something terrible happens again. It is always hard for me to understand why God would harden his heart each time. But finally, when everyone is hungry because there are no crops and no livestock and dead animals are piled up everywhere, God pulls one last horrific plan. He tells the Jewish people to kill a goat and paint the blood over the doors of their houses. And then he sends an angel to kill the firstborn of every house, but he passes over the Jewish houses. Well, this is enough for even Pharaoh. And he tells the Hebrew people that they can go. But by this point, they don't trust him very much, and so they don't wait for the bread to rise. They just make crackers with it and grab their few possessions and they run, which was in retrospect a very good idea because sure enough, the Egyptian army chases after them. But God has one more trick up his sleeve, and he commands Moses to lead the Hebrew people into the Red Sea, into the water. They argue about this. This seems like a crazy plan. You brought us out of slavery just to drown us. But as soon as they step into the water parts. And the Hebrews run across, and the Egyptians run after them, and then the water meets again and drowns the Egyptian soldiers that were chasing them. It would be a great ending. The Seder commemorates all of this. The tears of slavery are represented by dipping parsley in salt water and eating it. Horseradish, the bitter herb, is eaten on matzah, which represents the unleavened bread that they fled with. Haroset, my daughter's favorite, is a well-chopped mixture of apples and walnuts and cinnamon that represents the mortar of the bricks that the Hebrew slaves were forced to make and build with. The dinner continues with 4 glasses of wine, representing freedom from slavery and exile, the recitation of the plagues, the 4 questions, the invitation to Elijah to come and join us because we know what it is like to be strangers in a land. We sing Dayenu, it would have been enough, a prayer of gratitude for everything along the way. We talk about what we wish to be free of today, those things that still enslave us. But liberation was hard fought because before the Jewish people were led into the promised land, they spent 40 years in exile in the desert. 40 years. Makes a few months in quarantine seem not so bad. Our plagues today don't involve the death of livestock or grasshoppers or frogs, although frankly there has been a shocking amount of hail recently. Our plague today involves a virus that attacks in ways we still don't fully understand. A virus that can for now only be contained by staying in our homes and letting the transmission pass over us. Liberation without leaving the house. Alana Newhouse writes in an opinion piece for the New York Times that most Jews throughout history have not been free, whether from murderous regimes or famines or pandemics. What we have been is devoted to the idea that we deserve to be. The Haggadah's purpose is not, in fact, to present a narrative, Rabbi Mendel Herson, Associate Dean of the Rabbinical College of America, explained to me, she writes. It is a how-to guide to finding our own personal liberation. Ms. Newhouse writes of looking at a photograph of Jewish people baking matzah in a secretly made oven underneath the Lodz ghetto in Poland in World War II. These were Jews made slaves again in modern times, insisting on celebrating their God-given right to freedom, even as they were being denied their earthly equivalent. She writes, but what I really can't get over is the smile on the face of one of the women. There it is, again, still, the joy and the sacrifice. It is the smile of someone making Passover her own. She continues, our circumstances are much less dire than hers, but our task this year is still the same. We may be away from loved ones or shut out of communal spaces. We may not be preparing with the same vigor or shopping with the same zeal, but we will do what millions of Jews have done before us, manifest our hope for liberation. We are all manifesting our hope for liberation from inside our houses these days in so many different ways. Last week, in Joys and Sorrows, Elaine said that her joy was having so much time to spend with her family, playing games and going for walks and eating meals together. I think she speaks for a lot of people who long to be liberated from our overly scheduled lives. Over the last several years at the Gewurz's Seder dinners, we've asked each other, what do you need to be free from? And overscheduling is high up on that list. Interestingly, technology has also been high up on that list. We felt too tethered to our cell phones, but now I can't imagine trying to do this kind of isolation without an easy way of seeing other people's faces and hearing their voices. Some people are realizing that the adage, no one is free while others are oppressed, is powerful in this time. Most of us are blessed with houses, cozy homes with stocked kitchens. I can't even imagine what it is like to be homeless when everything is shut down, from the libraries to many of the shelters. I am so grateful that organizations like Do Good are going out and giving homeless people vouchers for motel rooms during this crisis, so they too may stay safe and stay home. The outbreak is really bringing home to many the inequalities of our nation and our world. The virus doesn't care who you are or how much money you have. And isolating folks in their homes hides people and hides societal problems, but just think about how many kids are going hungry because they're used to school lunches and breakfasts. Think about the injustice of a healthcare system that relies on employer-paid healthcare as the primary source of healthcare for people under 65 during a time when the unemployment rate is skyrocketing. Think about families with special needs kids who don't have school and their regular routines to follow. Quarantine will not last forever, but it will change our lives going forward. We don't have control over some things, but we may have more than we realize. How will you practice liberation right now? What will you do to free your mind from the stress of quarantine while following the important advice of scientists to stay at home so we can avoid spreading the virus and overwhelming our healthcare system? And how will you practice liberation going forward? What will this time teach you about justice and equity and compassion? What will this time teach you about your own need for contact and community? About what our neighborhoods and our nation need to be a system that truly works for all of its people? I pray that this crisis makes us work together and brings out the best in us. 9/11 brought us building community with our neighbors, proud to be Americans united together. It also brought racism and an us versus them mentality that we're already seeing in this crisis. I pray that states get help based on their needs and not the political beliefs of their governors. I pray that the aftermath brings healthcare for all and not totalitarianism. And I pray that we get through this with our compassion and our community intact, realizing that liberation was in us all along. May it be so, my friends. Blessed be, and amen.